Last time on This Man's Amazing Life.
New York attracted the dreamers, and nobody in New York is from here, that they all came here to chase their dreams from other places. My biological father, who I'll refer to as my sperm donor dad, Navy intelligence officer. And my mother was a talented artist. She became a waitress, which is where she met my father. My sperm donor dad, when he was in the Navy, he was stationed on the USS Kidd during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We ship out for Cuba first thing in the morning. President Kennedy got on the radio. He said, "Boys, this is the president. I want you to know that if I give the order, I'm ready to go." He explained to me that the mafia at the time ran the ports in New York. The earpiece of the headset had a special keyboard on the backside. Plug in this device and listen to any phone call being made in the neighborhood. How he could listen to all of my mother's phone calls was a conversation with these crazy ghetto people, some woman telling her husband or boyfriend or whatever he was that she was sucking another man's dick, people yelling, cursing. Sperm donor father told me that most people are completely crazy, and this is what I should come to expect from people when I grow up. You see that woman? She's a prostitute. That's a heroin addict. See that man? He's a pimp. He's a dealer. Sperm donor dad really did not like people in general. He told me it was just as important to see the bad side as it was to see the good side of people. Sperm donor dad had computers and was on the internet before it was the internet, back when it was called the bulletin board system, or BBS. He'd often do his telecommunications work from home, and he'd draw out for me charts that explained how data moved and computers talked to one another.
And now back to your regularly scheduled program.
Sperm donor dad hid a lot of his life from me. I discovered later on what his life really entailed. Sperm donor dad ran some bars in Manhattan. Bars back then were the connection between the streets and the penthouse suites. The bars were where drug dealers and pimps mingled with their newfound clients, the working classes, blue and white collar alike. Behind the bars sat the safes. The drug dealers would cut deals with the bar owners for exclusive rights to sell heroin inside the bars. The bars handled paying off the New York police to stay out of the business and would fill brown paper bags with cash each week for the local precinct. In those safes, the dealers kept their money. They did not want to bring it into the streets for fear of being robbed. The bars would take the cash and cut a check to the right person. People like Sperm donor dad had a deal with the bar owners. It was structured this way, an example. The beginning of the bar work week was Thursday night. If the bar took in, say, $5,000 of business by any given night, the rest that was made, the employees kept. From time to time, Sperm donor dad would have to regulate the criminals that operated in the bar. There's the story of a pimp who wore a very expensive pair of leather boots and always showed them off. The pimp began to get a little too comfortable in the bar. I guess he thought he owned the place. And one afternoon, he came running out of the restroom screaming that a large rat had run across his boots. Sperm donor dad saw his opportunity to chase the pimp out of the bar and came out from behind the bar, swept up the pimp by his legs, pulled one of the boots off of him, and went to the bathroom, beating the rat to death with one of those big-time expensive knee-high boots. He then took the pimp and 86'd him from the bar. Sperm donor dad's time running bars came to an end when he ran cross with a Cuban drug dealer pushing heroin. The Cubans were protected against law enforcement because of the national security issues with Cuba. The Cuban dealer parked his Cadillac outside of the bar, a giant status symbol. I don't know what Sperm donor dad was thinking. I know he worked as an enforcer from time to time, but he gave this man a beating in front of his clients and then dumped garbage on the hood of the car. In other words, telling all the addicts buying heroin from the man that his junk was worse than junk, that it was garbage. Sperm donor dad knew he did something stupid and immediately went underground, first holing up in a penthouse with some acid hippie, a Woodstock hangover on 97th Street, and then he took my mother up to Maine and through New England and they were married in Vermont, and he returned and moved in with her. No longer involved in crime, Sperm Donor Dad worked his union job straight, installing phone systems all throughout the city. He was truly on the front line of technology as it developed. He was always coming home with something new. A Nakamichi stereo that recorded on digital cassette tapes, a cable television box, multi-line phone systems, and a VHS VCR. It was during this time that he decided to quit drinking and stop riding motorcycles. Sperm Donor Dad's drinking and my family's devastating drinking issues I'll discuss later on. But right now, let's talk about those motorcycles. Sperm Donor Dad rode in a biker gang. Because he had tattoos from the neck down and a lot of them were of snakes pulling him strangely to hell, people called him Big Snake. He had a tattoo I always found interesting. It was of his ex-wife crucified with the words, "In love forever." He would hang out with some other greasy biker who fashioned 2 axes tied with rope to the back of his hog. I asked the man one day why he had those axes on his bike. He told me that if he got into a fight and had to use a weapon, he wanted to use one that had another purpose, so you can't be charged with intentional murder. If the cops ask why I have the axe, he said, it's because I go camping and need to cut firewood. Why 2? I asked. He said, because there's a lot of trees in the forest. I'll admit, as a kid, this stuff was the stuff of legends at the lunch table at school. Fuck with my dad and he'll chop your head off stuff. The story always went that my mother too rode a motorcycle, but I never saw a picture of her with one. Apparently she sold scooters imported from Europe on the street down on Park Avenue where the car dealerships were, right near the Maseratis and the Porsches. She sold Vespas and the like on commission, but I guess it didn't work out. This is decades before you'd see these things on the streets with regularity. Growing up in New York City is an experience like none other, and I think I should lay some real heavy rap on you brothers and sisters right now and give you the straight scoop on a few things about being a kid in the metropolis of NYC and what that experience is like. I've heard childhood in New York described many ways, but the best way was that kids raised in the city are born with hair on their chests and some even with hair on their teeth. And that in this great city of 8 million souls, the most amazing, most inspiring, and most depraved people all exist together. It's true that when people from New York say things like, I ate lunch and this celebrity or that celebrity came and sat next to me, this stuff is real. Any true New Yorker knows that you're best only to discuss these things with other true New Yorkers, because people who are not from here, people from the small towns, people from the sticks, they have no idea what it's like to spend a day, let alone the first quarter century of their lives, in the city of 1 million millionaires, as it was known. They instantly think that you're lying when you tell them things like Denzel Washington and Michael J. Fox are my neighbors, or the sewers here have alligators, or there's this guy who lives in the housing projects that had a tiger and a crocodile too as pets. All of this stuff sounds like fantasy and nonsense to people who are not from here. But this is the reality of growing up in the city that set the standard for a nation that in turn set the standard for the world. New York was, and Wall Street was, and Fifth Avenue was the center of business, art, and culture in the United States. And these things left here today in huts in African deserts, in caves in Siberia, in desolate, forlorn locations from the south to the north poles and all parts in between. You'll see representations of the culture from here, be it a poster of Biggie Smalls, a video of a WWE wrestling match, or a baseball hat with the letters NYPD on it. As a kid growing up in New York, as far away as Mogadishu, Somalia, you'll see these things in people's huts. Growing up in New York, you had 2 planets. You had planet Earth and planet New York. When I grew up in New York City, the poorest zip code in the nation, the South Bronx, sat less than a mile across the river from the wealthiest zip code, the Upper East Side. My very first memory in my life is being put into winter clothes in the living room as the sun shined in from outside. I could hear the noise outside and see the rays of light coming in. And my mother and sperm donor began to argue. They went into the kitchen and my mother slammed the door, a favorite pastime of hers, and I could hear them screaming and yelling at each other. This is the first memory I have of my childhood, my earliest one. It was also how I learned Sperm Donor Dad's name, because my mother said, "You always do this, Bill." I remember they were arguing and it was so hot. I was baking in my winter clothes. I was a small child and so uncomfortable, and I wanted so badly to go outside. And it seemed like an eternity that they fought. My next memories, and these are chronological in nature, are as follows. My mother had 3 sisters, and her entire family, including herself, all battled and lost the battle with alcohol. A few lost it with their lives far too young. 2 of the 3 sisters died a few years apart from one another when I was still a child, and the third of my mother's sisters lived into her 70s, but like the others, had a whole host of troubles that can be attributed at least in part to alcohol abuse. I can recall as a small child visiting my Aunt Anne at her apartment. She was bedridden and I believe dying of lung cancer. While she lied there, being given oxygen on her deathbed, her husband, a music studio owner, was mixing margaritas and serving all of the guests. My next memory in life is waking up on the sofa bed I slept on in the living room, and my mother was petting my head, brushing my hair with the palm of her hand. I could see tears flowing down her face, but she had a smile on. I asked her why she was crying. She said, "Your Aunt Anne went to heaven." She looked out the window and then said, "The sun shines when people go to heaven." I asked her about heaven, and she told me Aunt Anne was up there in heaven, watching over me. I have a few memories of my Aunt Kay and how nervous my mother would get every time she came around. I was very young and found her loud, boisterous, and at a fast pace about everything. I did not know that she was drunk, and that was why she acted like she did. She had a crew cut and always wore a leather jacket and smelled like perfume. And my mother and her shared this trait that just drove my sperm donor dad nuts. The 2 of them would enter the apartment in the blistering cold winter and start to complain about being hot, fanning themselves and the whole 9 yards. They'd open windows even in blizzards, screaming, "It's so hot in here! Jesus, somebody open a window!" and stuff like that. This pissed my sperm donor dad off to no end. At Aunt Anne's funeral, Aunt Kay stood up near the front of the pews, and I stood with my mother in the back. My mother was having a conversation with another woman, maybe Aunt Sheila, and one of them said, "She's drunk right now." Aunt Kay's apartment, which was over a bar, smelled horrible and was a mess. Sperm Donor would occasionally have to take her, bottle in her hands, to the hospital to have her treated for alcohol poisoning. My mother took me to her apartment one day when she was in the hospital, and I watched as she opened up her kitchen cabinets, and they were filled with vodka bottles, and my mother poured them down the sink. My mother and sperm donor dad always told me that Aunt Kay had a disease of the mind and could not stop drinking. One day she was found dead, face down behind her couch in her filthy apartment. It was explained to me that she had a massive brain aneurysm and died because her blood stopped flowing to the brain. Another of my earliest memories was the very first time I went to the movies. The very first movie I ever saw, believe it or not, was Mad Max. Sperm Donor was having another argument with my mother one night and scooped me up and told her, "I'm taking him to the movies." She was not happy about this, but he walked out the door with me, and I remember going down the streets, almost running to catch up with him, excited to be going to see a movie. "What movie are we going to see?" I asked him. "Mad Max," he said. "Why is he mad?" I kept asking. Sperm Donor took me to the Thalia Theater on Broadway. He bought us each a popcorn and soda, and I remember the floors were so sticky they could pull the shoes off of your feet. I sat with my legs crossed in the seat. The only other person in the theater was a homeless man in the back corner. He seemed to have all of his worldly possessions with him. When the lights went down and the film started, you could hear the rats scurrying underneath the seats. I remember the screen flashing big black dots from a dirty projector, and Sperm Donor started griping about this. I remember the car chase scenes as being exciting, and when we got home, all I could talk about was how Mad Max drove this fast car and fought these guys on motorcycles and the like, all to my mother's chagrin. She was very upset that Sperm Donor Dad had taken me to see a movie with all this violence in it. We had a dog named Nellie. One day the dog snapped at me, and I walked up behind her and grabbed her by her 2 ears and bit her between the ears. I was still so young that I was in diapers, but my mother told this story, as they say, until the cows came home. She joked with me, saying she was going to get the newspapers to write an article about it. Boy bites dog, read all about it, or boy bites dog back, get your copy here. My mother loved animals. She called them all angels, but she hated this dog. So much so that she got rid of the poor pooch. One year during the holidays, the dog was acting up so much and so frequently that my mother flipped her top. It began one day during a walk as I was in my stroller. The dog got excited about something, tried to run after it, got the leash tied up in my stroller, and dragged me down the street. It was so long ago, but I remember this so clearly. I have a perfect memory of this. The stroller had a turquoise color seat to it, and I can still see the look of horror on my mother's face and the panic as she finally corralled the dog, and an onlooker came by to ask if she was all right or if I was hurt. After that came Thanksgiving. Sperm Donor was always moonlighting on the holidays as a bodyguard or setting up stages for rock bands. I think that on this evening he'd set up a stage for David Bowie and called my mother and said, "This guy's wearing a dress on TV, turn the TV on." Anyhow, my mother made a fairly good Thanksgiving spread. Turkey, cranberries, stuffing, you name it. She'd invited over a priest who I'm actually named after, a man called Uncle Finbar. He was a Catholic missionary who sat praying next to my mother when she was a young woman afflicted by a rare disease called dermatomyositis. People who have this are called myocytes. The illness paralyzed her for about a year of her life, and Uncle Finbar stayed at her side praying for her recovery. If I recall, he lived in Brooklyn right near Sunset Park. He took the train to spend Thanksgiving with us, but had to get back to Brooklyn before we could serve the food. My mother insisted on walking him to the subway. Imagine that. New York was so screwed up even back then that you had to worry about the gangs attacking a priest in his white clerical collar and all on Thanksgiving. When we came back from taking Uncle Finbar to the subway, we found the table missing the Thanksgiving turkey and cranberries. My mother went wild. Well, she spotted the dog face down in the turkey, and the pooch panicked and ran underneath some furniture, and my mother went after her with a broom. The dog puked up all the cranberries and turkey, and my mother kept trying to hit her with the broom head. That Christmas, my mother made her usual stink about setting up the Christmas tree with her friend, an atheist who hated the Catholic Church named Carol. I always thought that was something, an atheist who hated the church and hated the Lord, but celebrated the holy holiday. They'd been friends since the 1950s, and despite the bizarre contradictions in a non-believer doing this, they collected Christmas tree ornaments together since the days when Elvis gyrated on stage making girls pee in their panties. Go figure. Some of the ornaments were beautiful, to say the least. Glass and ceramic, things like the man in the moon dressed up in an astronaut suit and a gold-trimmed train engine. Each year the tree got bigger and bigger and took longer and longer to set up. This particular year they filled the tree with candy canes, and all I remember was hearing a scream and seeing two paws hanging onto the tree for dear life as it came crashing to the ground. The dog had seen the candy canes and jumped into the tree, pulling it down and smashing a lot of these ornaments to a million pieces. Nellie soon relocated to the Canine Witness Protection Program. My mom got rid of the dog after that. My parents' relationship began to fall apart. It seemed like we never had any money for anything. Whenever we needed something like an appliance or a radio, we were always told by my mother that we'd have to save up for it. But I did have lots of toys as a kid, I remember that much. I even had a gigantic electric train set that Sperm Donor put on top of two 4x8 pieces of plywood. It was so impressive and people would marvel at it. I still don't know what happened to it. One day it was just gone. Oddly, we slept on mattresses on the floor, no bed frame, all of us in one bed together. If you ask me why my parents' relationship began to sour like it did, my best guess would be that my mother found out about my father's other wives. I don't know if he was a bigamist or not, but right around that time he received word that a woman he'd married in Florida, far older than him, had passed away.
Next time on This Man's Amazing Life. Episode number 3. Benjamin talks about his parents' big fight. He talks about his cousins and how they were kidnapped and brought to Ireland by their father. And he discusses wrestling mania in his school, and his sperm donor father taking him to the matches at Madison Square Garden. All of that and more here tomorrow on This Man's Amazing Life.